You're watching the Everything Network.
Frank Nitti was an Italian-American organized crime figure based in Chicago and bodyguard of Al Capone. He was in charge of all money flowing through the operation. He later succeeded Capone as acting boss of the Chicago outfit. He was born Francesco Raffaele Nitto on January 27, 1886, in the town of Angri, province of Salerno, Campania, Italy. He was the second child of Luigi and Rosina Fezza Nitto. While later journalists reported Nitti and Al Capone were cousins, this was not in fact the case. Their families did, however, stay blocks away from each other in Brooklyn, and had come from the same area in Italy. His father died in 1888 when Frank was 2 years old. Within a year, his mother married Francesco Dolendo. Although 2 children were born to the couple, neither survived, leaving Francesco and his older sister Giovannina the only children. Francesco Dolendo emigrated to the United States in July 1890, and the rest of the family followed in June 1893 when Nitti was 7. The family settled at 113 Navy Street, Brooklyn, New York City. Little Francesco attended public school and worked odd jobs after school to support the family. His 15-year-old sister married a 24-year-old man. His mother gave birth to his half-brother Raphael in 1894, and another child, Gennaro, in 1896. After the 7th grade, he quit school and worked as a pin setter, factory worker, and barber. Al Capone's family lived nearby, and Nitti was friends with Capone's older brothers in the criminal gang, the Navy Street Boys. A worsening relationship with Dolendo urged him to leave home in 1900s when Nitti was 14, to work in various local factories. Around 1910, at the age of 24, he left Brooklyn. The next years of his life are poorly documented, and little can be ascertained. He may have worked in the Williamsburg neighborhood of Brooklyn around 1911. He probably moved to Chicago around 1913, working as a barber and making the acquaintance of gangsters Alex Louis Greenberg and Dion O'Banion. He married Chicagoan Rosa Rose Levitt in Dallas, Texas on October 18, 1917. The couple's movements after their marriage remain uncertain. By 1918, Nitti had settled at 914 South Halsted Street. Nitti quickly renewed his contacts with Greenberg and O'Banion, becoming a jewel thief, liquor smuggler, and fence. Through his liquor smuggling activities, Nitti came to the attention of Chicago crime boss John Papa Johnny Torrio and Torrio's newly arrived soldier, Al Capone. Nitti, being a newcomer and familiar with the Texas area, became a partner in the Galveston crime syndicate run by Johnny Jack Nouns. He is reported to have stolen a large sum of money from Nouns and fellow mobster Dutch Voigt in 1924, after which Nitti fled back to Chicago. Years later, he was spotted at a Houston bar, which was brought to the attention of Nouns and Voigt. The 2 Galveston mobsters found Nitti, drove him back to Galveston, and made him return the money he had stolen. Under Torrio's successor, Al Capone, Nitti's reputation soared. Nitti ran Capone's liquor smuggling and distribution operation, importing whiskey from Canada and selling it through a network of speakeasies around Chicago. Nitti was one of Capone's top lieutenants, trusted for his leadership skills and business acumen, because Nitti's ancestry was from the same town as Capone's. He could help Capone penetrate the Sicilian and Camorra underworld in a way Capone alone never could. Capone thought so highly of Nitti that when he went to prison in 1929, he named Nitti as a member of a triumvirate that ran the mob in his place. He was head of operations, with Jake Greasy Thumb Guzik as head of administration, and Tony Joe Batters Accardo as head of enforcement. Despite his nickname, the Enforcer, he used mafia soldiers and others to commit violence rather than do it himself. In earlier days, Nitti had been one of Capone's trusted personal bodyguards. Still, as he rose in the organization, Frank's business instinct dictated that he must personally avoid the dirty work for which hitmen were paid. Frank and Rose divorced in 1928, and shortly thereafter he married Anna Ronga, daughter of a mob doctor and former neighbor of Frank's family in the 1920s. The couple adopted a son, Joseph, through the Tennessee Children's Home Society. In 1931, both Nitti and Capone were convicted of tax evasion and sent to prison. However, Nitti received an 18-month sentence which was served at the United States Penitentiary, Leavenworth, while Capone was sent away for 11 years. When Nitti was released on March 25, 1932, he took his place as the new boss of the Capone gang. While some revisionist historians claim that Nitti was a mere front boss, while Paul the Waiter Ricca was the actual boss of the Chicago outfit, both contemporary and modern accounts confirm that Capone's successor was indeed Nitti. According to Nitti biographer Mars Agigian, Nitti's age, brilliance, and reputation in the underworld made him Capone's personal choice for successor, rather than less experienced mobsters such as Paul Ricca or Murray Humphreys. In actuality, Ricca was merely the acting boss of the Chicago outfit for 6 months, between Capone's October 1931 imprisonment and Nitti's March 1932 release. With the recently released Nitti paranoid about violating his federal parole, Ricca was acting in the capacity of emissary that same month when he was arrested with Lucky Luciano, Meyer Lansky, and other mobsters by Chicago police, and prominently photographed. This picture caused some to incorrectly conclude that Ricca was the new boss of the Chicago mob. With Nitti calling the shots, the Chicago outfit branched out from prostitution and gambling into other areas, including control of labor unions, which led to the extortion of many businesses. On December 19, 1932, a team of Chicago police, headed by Detective Sergeants Harry Lang and Harry Miller, raided Nitti's office in room 554 at 221 North LaSalle Street in Chicago. Lang shot Nitti 3 times in the back and neck. He then shot himself, a minor flesh wound, to make the shooting look like self-defense, claiming that Frank had shot him first. Court testimony later insisted that the murder attempt was personally ordered by newly elected Chicago Mayor Anton Cermak, who supposedly wanted to eliminate the Chicago outfit in favor of gangsters who answered to him. Nitti survived the shooting and in February 1933 was acquitted of attempted murder. During that same trial, Miller testified that Lang received $15,000, equal to $353,059 today, to kill Nitti. Another uniformed officer at the shooting testified that Nitti was shot while unarmed. Harry Lang and Harry Miller were both fired from the police force and each fined $100, equal to $2,354 today for simple assault. 2 months later, Cermak was shot and killed by Giuseppe Zangara while he was talking to President-elect Franklin D. Roosevelt. Roosevelt was Zangara's target but missed. A conspiracy theory emerged sometime before 1999, originating in Chicago, asserting that Zangara was a hired killer working for Nitti. John William Toohey, author of numerous books on organized crime in Chicago, after reviewing Secret Service records, described in detail in a 2002 article his interpretation of how and why Cermak was the real target and the relationship of the shooting to the rampant gang violence in Chicago. The theory is enhanced by numerous researchers, citing their analysis of court testimony, asserting that Cermak had directed an assassination attempt on Nitti fewer than 3 months earlier. In 1943, many top members of the Chicago outfit were indicted for extorting the Hollywood film industry. Among those prosecuted were Nitti, Phil D'Andrea, Louis Little New York Campagna, Nick Cerchella, Charles Cherry Nose Gioia, Ralph Pierce, Ricca, and John Handsome Johnny Roselli. The outfit was accused of trying to extort money from some of the largest movie studios, including Columbia Pictures, Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, Paramount Pictures, RKO Pictures, and 20th Century Fox. The studios had cooperated with the outfit to avoid union trouble, unrest itself stirred up by the mob. At a meeting of outfit leaders at Nitti's home, Ricca blamed Nitti for the indictments. Ricca said that since this had been Nitti's scheme and that of the FBI informant Willie Byoff, one of Nitti's trusted associates, Frank should go to prison. A severe claustrophobe due to his first prison term, Nitti dreaded the idea of another prison confinement. It was also rumored that he was suffering from terminal cancer at this time. He ultimately decided to take his own life. The day before his scheduled grand jury appearance, Nitti had breakfast with his wife in their home at 712 Selborne Road in Riverside, Illinois. When his wife was leaving for church, Nitti told her he planned to take a walk. Then he began to drink heavily. He loaded a .32 caliber revolver, put it in his coat pocket, and walked 5 blocks to a local railroad yard. Conductor William F. Seebauer and switchman L.M. Barnett and E.H. Moran were riding in the caboose, backing their train slowly southward over an ungated Cermak road in North Riverside. The workers spotted an oblivious Nitti walking on the track away from them and shouted a warning. Nitti walked off the tracks, staggering towards the fence. 3 shots rang out. The workers thought Nitti was shooting at them, but then realized he was trying to shoot himself in the head. The final fatal bullet entered behind Nitti's right ear and lodged in the top of his skull. Police Chief Alan Rose of North Riverside, rushing to the scene with a sergeant and several beat patrolmen, recognized Nitti immediately. An autopsy by William McNally, coroner's toxicologist, showed that Nitti's blood alcohol level was at .23. A coroner's jury ruled the following day that Nitti committed suicide while temporarily insane and in a despondent frame of mind. Nicodemo Domenico Scarfo, also known as Little Nicky, served as boss of the Philadelphia crime family from 1981 to 1990. Infamously known for his murderous reputation, Scarfo led the family through its bloodiest period, until his conviction in 1988. During his criminal career, he engaged in organized crime activities such as drug trafficking, extortion, labor union racketeering, and gambling. In 1988, he was convicted of multiple charges including conspiracy, racketeering, and first-degree murder. His trial consisted of the damaging testimonies of several informants who had carried out his murders. Scarfo died in prison on January 13, 2017, while serving his 55-year sentence. He was the father of Nicky Scarfo Jr., a Lucchese family soldier who was sentenced in 2015 to 30 years in prison for security fraud, racketeering, and illegal gambling. Scarfo was born on March 8, 1929, in Brooklyn, New York, to Philip and Catherine Scarfo, Italian immigrants from Naples and Calabria. At the age of 12, Scarfo and his family moved to South Philadelphia, where he worked as a day laborer and later graduated from Benjamin Franklin High School in 1947. He became an amateur boxer, fighting in small clubs throughout Philadelphia, earning himself a reputation for his aggressive temper in the ring. After failing to become a success in the boxing world, he joined his uncle Nicky Buck, a Philly mob soldier, in illegal activities in Philadelphia. He also worked as a bartender at a club owned by his uncle, while being apprenticed by Buck, alongside his 2 other uncles. In 1954, Scarfo was proposed for membership into the Philadelphia crime family. He was inducted by then-boss Joseph Ida at a ceremony held in New Jersey, alongside 2 of his uncles, who were also inducted as full-fledged soldiers. Scarfo was reportedly arrogant and stubborn, having declined to marry the daughter of consigliere Joe Rugnetta, leaving him embarrassed and disrespected, briefly causing friction within the family. In 1963, Scarfo pleaded guilty to manslaughter for fatally stabbing a longshoreman. He spent about 6 months in prison. After his release, he was sent to Atlantic City, New Jersey by Angelo Bruno to oversee the operations there. Scarfo served almost 2 years in prison from 1971 to 1973 for refusing to testify to the New Jersey State Commission of Investigation. He served time with boss Angelo Bruno and Genovese crime family members Gerardo Catena and Louis Manna, the latter of whom he formed a close relationship with. In 1976, Atlantic City legalized gambling, and Scarfo prioritized gambling as his main source of income. At the time he was dispatched to Atlantic City, it was considered a backwater. However, its rise as a gambling mecca made Scarfo a powerhouse. His cement contracting company, Scarf Inc., which was shared with his nephew, received business As developers built new casinos in Atlantic City, Scarfo would intimidate businesses into buying from his company. Him and his associate, Nicholas "Nick the Blade" Virgilio, shot and murdered Judge Edwin Helfont in '78 for refusing to cooperate with them and to help Virgilio receive a lighter sentence as he was facing murder charges. In exchange for $12,500, Scarfo acted as the getaway driver. Meanwhile, Virgilio fired numerous rounds into the judge as he dined with his wife in a restaurant. He made it a public execution and made him an example to anyone that wasn't willing to give him what he wanted. In 1979, criminal associate and contractor Vincent Falcone was shot twice and killed by Scarfo's nephew Phil Leonetti on Scarfo's orders, after making negative remarks about the company and Scarfo. Longtime boss Angelo Bruno was murdered in 1980. His murder was orchestrated by his consigliere, Antonio Caponegro. Weeks later, Caponegro faced the consequence of killing a boss without the approval of the American Mafia Commission. He was found shot dozens of times in a car trunk, and $300 in bills were jammed in his mouth and anus as a sign of his own greed. Phil Testa became the new boss of the Philadelphia crime family, appointing Scarfo as his consigliere. However, his tenure as boss would be a short one. Testa was killed by a nail bomb under his porch in 1981, on orders of his underboss and drug trafficker Peter Casella and Capo Frank Narducci Sr., which later resulted in Narducci being gunned down and Casella being banished from the mob and fleeing to Florida. Testa's murder sparked a war within the family. Scarfo seized the top position for himself, promoting Salvatore Merlino as his underboss and Frank Monte as his consigliere. Scarfo would go on to lead the family for a decade with a bloody rampage, fueled by paranoia and aggression. Between August 1982 and January 1984, Scarfo was imprisoned in FCI La Tuna for gun possession. While in prison, Scarfo always had two bodyguards accompanying him, who were associates of the Mexican mafia, whom he referred to as his pistoleros. During that time, aging Capo Harry Riccobene began to form another faction that opposed Scarfo. The war would cost him his little brother's life, his brother Mario to become a government informant, and Riccobene himself to be given a life sentence for first-degree murder. In 1984, Scarfo ordered the death of Salvatore Testa, one of his capos and top hitmen, as Testa's ambition and growing popularity made Scarfo feel threatened. Testa was the son of former boss Phil Testa, who had been Scarfo's close friend and mentor. As a result of Salvatore Testa's murder, Scarfo gained a reputation for disloyalty, and several criminal organizations across the United States began to distrust him. In 1985, Scarfo plotted to extort $1 million from major commercial developer Willard Rouse, sending his soldier Nicholas Caramandi and another associate to do it. Rouse refused and immediately contacted the FBI. The FBI began a case to tackle Scarfo, sending an undercover agent to pose as a representative of Rouse. This led Caramandi, a notable and feared hitman, to cooperate and testify against the organization. Caramandi was indicted for his role in the extortion case and decided to testify in court. Between 1987 and 1989, Scarfo was convicted 3 times for conspiracy, racketeering, and first-degree murder, being sentenced to consecutive prison terms of 14 years, 55 years, and life, although the life sentence was later overturned. Scarfo's nephew, Phil Leonetti, who he had promoted to underboss in 1986, also turned state's evidence in 1989 after a RICO conviction. During the trial, Scarfo's son, Mark Scarfo, attempted suicide on November 1, 1988. Mark, then only 17 years old, had been taunted for years by classmates about his father's criminal activities. Increasingly despondent over his father's possible imprisonment, Mark Scarfo hanged himself in the office of his father's concrete supply company in Atlantic City. He was discovered by his mother, and paramedics were able to resuscitate him. He suffered cardiac arrest and his brain was deprived of oxygen. He entered a coma where he remained until his death in April 2014. Born in Italy, Tommy Eboli stood 5 feet 10 inches, weighed 165 pounds, and had a tattoo on his right arm. He was the brother of Genovese crime family Capo Pasquale Paddy Ryan Eboli. To hide his Italian heritage, Eboli adapted the nickname Tommy Ryan from the professional boxer. He officially became a U.S. citizen on August 27, 1960. He was married to Anna Areola from Melrose Park, Illinois. Their children were Thomas Eboli Jr. and Chicago outfit mobster Louis "the Mooch" Eboli. The Mooch died in 1987 from cancer at the age of 52. After separating from Areola, Eboli entered a relationship with Mary Perello. They had 2 daughters, Maddalena and Mary, and a son, Saverio. Eboli also had 2 daughters, Roseanne and Joanne, from when he was together with Helen Nagy of Jackson Heights. Eboli and his third family lived in a high-rise apartment building in Fort Lee, New Jersey, that overlooked the Hudson River. However, just before his death, Eboli had purchased a home in Fair Lawn, New Jersey. As a young man, he worked as a professional boxer. In the early 1920s, during Prohibition, he became a bootlegger for future crime boss Lucky Luciano. By the early 1930s, Eboli had become the personal bodyguard for Luciano's underboss, Vito Don Vito Genovese. Some sources claim that Tommy committed as many as 20 murders for the Genovese family. In 1933, he was arrested on 6 counts of illegal gambling and disorderly conduct. At some point during the 1930s or 1940s, Eboli became a boxing manager. One of his early boxing protégés was future Genovese family boss Vincent Gigante. On January 11, 1952, he assaulted 2 officials during a professional boxing match at Manhattan's Madison Square Garden Arena. On that evening, he was managing middleweight boxer Rocky Castellani, who was fighting Ernie the Rock Durando. After Durando knocked down Castellani in the 6th and 7th rounds, referee Ray Miller stopped the fight and awarded a technical knockout victory to Durando. At that point, an enraged Eboli entered the boxing ring and punched Miller. Later in Castellani's dressing room, Tommy kicked Al Weil, the boxing promoter. Sport writers later speculated that Eboli had expected his fighter to win due to an illegal arrangement with Weil. On January 23, 1952, Eboli was indicted on 2 counts of assault from the boxing incident. On May 26, 1952, Tommy pleaded guilty to reduced charges and was later sentenced to 60 days in prison, his only incarceration during a life of crime. The New York State Athletic Commission also banned him from boxing for life. In 1957, Genovese finally became boss, and Eboli became the capo regime over the old Greenwich Village crew. Eboli was said to own several tourist nightclubs and gay bars in Midtown Manhattan and Lower Manhattan. Eboli also controlled rackets on the Hudson River docks in Manhattan. He was also the owner of Jet Music Corporation, a jukebox supplier, and Tryon Cigarette Vending Service, Inc. On April 17, 1959, Genovese was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison, leaving Tommy as acting boss of the family. Gerardo Jerry Catena became underboss, and Michelle Big Mike Miranda became consigliere. Anthony Tony Bender Strollo became his top aide. Some authors claim that for the next 10 years, family decisions were made collectively by a committee ruling panel that included Eboli, Catena, and Capo Philip Lombardo. Other authors state that Miranda, not Lombardo, was the 3rd member of this panel. On February 14, 1969, Genovese died of natural causes in prison, leaving the Genovese family hierarchy in turmoil. Eboli was a logical successor, but his health had deteriorated that year, plus he was under investigation. On July 28, 1969, he suffered his 3rd heart attack of that year. He was rushed to New York University Medical Center in Manhattan, where he eventually recovered. His previous heart attack occurred on July 17th, 2 days after appearing before the New Jersey State Investigation Committee in hearings on organized crime. Eboli first suffered an attack in February 1969 at a New York State Investigation Commission meeting. However, both law enforcement and other mobsters believed that he had faked some of these attacks. After Genovese's death, Catena became the new official boss. However, Catena was indicted and jailed in 1970. With Catena gone, Eboli now became the official boss of the Genovese family. However, Lombardo and Miranda were really in charge, and Tommy was just a front for law enforcement. Eboli continued as the front boss of the family for the next 2 years. However, he wanted to be the real head of the Genovese family. To further his advancement, he borrowed $4 million from the commission chairman and head of the rival Gambino crime family, Carlo Gambino, to fund a new drug trafficking operation. However, law enforcement soon shut down Eboli's drug racket and arrested most of his crew. Gambino and his underboss, Agnello Della Croce, allegedly came to Eboli to get their money back, but he did not have it. Gambino then allegedly ordered Eboli's murder due to lack of payment. However, it is believed that Gambino actually wanted to replace Eboli with Funzi Thierry, and that Gambino used the drug trafficking operation to get Tommy caught up with the law. On July 16, 1972, Tommy left his girlfriend's apartment in Crown Heights, Brooklyn around 1 and walked to his chauffeured Cadillac car. As he sat in the parked car, a gunman in a passing truck shot him 5 times. Hit in the head and neck, Eboli died instantly. No one was ever charged in his murder. Leroy Nicholas Barnes was born on October 15, 1933, in Harlem, New York City, into an African-American family. A good student in his youth, Nicky Barnes left home early to escape his abusive alcoholic father, turning to drug dealing for income. Barnes himself became addicted to heroin for several years in his 20s until spending time in jail when he ended his addiction. He was sent to prison in 1965 for low-level drug dealing, and while in prison he met Crazy Joe Gallo, a capo in the Colombo crime family, and Matthew Madonna, a heroin dealer for the Lucchese crime family. Gallo wanted to have a greater presence in the Harlem heroin market, but did not have any personnel to deal in the predominantly African-American areas. It is believed Gallo passed on his knowledge of how to run a drug trafficking organization to Nicky Barnes and asked him to assemble the necessary personnel. When Gallo was released from jail, he provided a lawyer for the Harlem Gangster, who subsequently had his conviction overturned on a technicality. On his return to New York City, he began to assemble his personnel and began cutting and packaging heroin. In 1972, to deal more efficiently with other black gangsters in Harlem, Barnes founded the Council, a 7-man organization consisting of Barnes, Joseph Jazz Hayden, Wallace Rice, Thomas Gaps Foreman, Ishmael Muhammad, Frank James, and Guy Fisher. The council was modeled after the Italian-American mafia families, where it settled disputes among the criminals and handled distribution problems and other drug trade-related issues. By 1976, his operations spread throughout all of New York State and into Pennsylvania and Canada. According to DEA records, his operation in 1976 consisted of 7 lieutenants, who each controlled a dozen mid-level distributors, who in turn supplied upwards of 40 street-level dealers each. Nicky set up front companies to protect some of his assets, such as numerous car dealerships, which appeared to be rented through those companies. The DEA eventually discovered the true ownership of the companies and seized the cars, including a Bentley, a Citroën SM, a Maserati, a Mercedes-Benz, a yellow Volvo, and several Cadillacs, Lincoln Continentals, and Ford Thunderbirds. His net worth had reached over $50 million at the height of his career. A New York Times article estimated Barnes purchased hundreds of tailor-made suits, Italian shoes, coats, and jewelry, which alone was valued at over $7 million. During this time, he had become the dominant drug lord in Harlem and was given the name Mr. Untouchable after successfully beating numerous charges and arrests. It is believed while under surveillance, he would often make pointless stops and go on high-speed chases with little purpose other than to aggravate those following him. The council also employed contract killers, including Robert Willie Sanchez Young. On June 5, 1977, the New York Times Magazine released an article titled Mr. Untouchable, featuring him posing on the front cover. The magazine told Barnes that they were going to use a mugshot of him unless he posed for the cameras. Barnes, who hated mugshots, agreed and took the shot. In response to his apparent confidence in his own invulnerability, President Jimmy Carter ordered the Justice Department to intensify its efforts to prosecute him. The resulting prosecution saw Barnes convicted for drug-related crimes and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole on January 19, 1978. The chief prosecutor in the case was Robert B. Fisk, then the United States Attorney for the Southern District of New York. According to Nicky Barnes, while in prison, he discovered that his assets were not being maintained, and the council had stopped paying his attorney's fees. Barnes discovered that one of his fellow council members, Guy Fisher, was having an affair with Barnes's mistress. The council had a rule that no council member would sleep with another council member's wife or mistress, so in response, Barnes decided to become a federal informant. He forwarded a list of 109 names, 5 of them council members, along with his wife's name, implicating them all in illegal activities related to the heroin trade. Barnes helped to indict 44 other traffickers, 16 of whom were ultimately convicted. In his testimony, he implicated himself in 8 murders. While in prison, he also won a national poetry contest for federal inmates, earned a college diploma with honors, and taught fellow inmates English. In 1984, Fisher was convicted of multiple counts of RICO violations, including continuing criminal conspiracy, drug trafficking, and murder, and was sentenced to life in prison without eligibility for parole. Fisher's conviction was facilitated by the testimony of his former mentor, associate, and rival, Leroy "Nicky" Barnes. Frank Lucas was an American drug lord who operated in Harlem, New York City, during the late 1960s and early 1970s. He was known for cutting out middlemen in the drug trade and buying heroin directly from his source in the Golden Triangle in Southeast Asia. Lucas boasted that he smuggled heroin using the coffins of dead American servicemen, as depicted in the feature film American Gangster, which fictionalized aspects of his life. This claim was denied by his Southeast Asian associate Leslie Ike Atkinson. In 1976, Lucas was convicted of drug trafficking and sentenced to 70 years in prison, but after becoming an informant, he and his family were placed in the Witness Protection Program. In 1981, his federal and state prison sentences were reduced to time served plus lifetime parole. In 1984, he was convicted on drug charges and was released from prison in 1991. In 2012, he pled guilty to attempting to cash a $17,000 federal disability benefit check twice, and because of his age and poor health, received a sentence of 5 years probation. Lucas was born and raised in North Carolina. He said the incident that motivated him to embark on a life of crime was him witnessing his 12-year-old cousin's murder at the hands of the Ku Klux Klan for looking flirtatiously at a white woman. He drifted through a life of petty crime until one occasion when he got into a fight with a former employer with whose daughter he had been having an affair. In the fight, Lucas hit the father on the head with a pipe, knocking him unconscious. He then stole $400 from the company's safe and set the establishment on fire. Later, Frank fled to New York City at the behest of his mother, who feared that he would either be imprisoned for life or lynched. Once in Harlem, he quickly began indulging in petty crime and pool hustling before he was taken under the wing of gangster Bumpy Johnson. His connection to Johnson has since come under some doubt. He claimed to have been Johnson's driver for 15 years, although Johnson spent just 5 years out of prison before his death in 1968. According to Johnson's widow, much of the narrative that Lucas claimed as his actually belonged to another young hustler named Zach Walker, who lived with Johnson and his family and later betrayed him. After Johnson's death, Lucas traveled around and came to the realization that, to be successful, he would have to break the monopoly that the mafia held in New York. Traveling to Bangkok, Thailand, he eventually made his way to Jack's American Star Bar, an R&R hangout for black soldiers. Here he met former U.S. Army Sergeant Leslie Ike Atkinson, who was from Goldsboro, North Carolina, and married to one of Lucas's cousins. Lucas is quoted as saying, "Ike knew everyone over there, every black guy in the Army from the cooks on up." Atkinson, nicknamed Sergeant Smack by the Drug Enforcement Administration, has said he shipped drugs in furniture, not caskets. Whatever method he used, Lucas smuggled the drugs into the United States with this direct link from Asia. Lucas said that he made $1 million per day selling drugs on 116th Street, though this was later discovered to be an exaggeration. Federal Judge Sterling Johnson, who was the special narcotics prosecutor for the city of New York at the time of Lucas's crimes, called Lucas's operation one of the most outrageous international dope smuggling gangs ever. An innovator who got his own connections outside the U.S. and then sold the narcotics himself in the street. Lucas trusted only relatives and close friends from North Carolina to handle his various heroin operations. Lucas thought they were less likely to steal from him and be tempted by various vices in the big city. He stated his heroin, Blue Magic, was 98 to 100% pure when shipped from Thailand. Lucas has been quoted as saying that his worth was something like $52 million, most of it in Cayman Islands banks. Added to this is maybe 1,000 kilograms, or 2,200 pounds of dope on hand, with a potential profit of no less than $300,000 per kilo. This huge profit margin allowed him to buy property all over the country, including office buildings in Detroit and apartments in Los Angeles and Miami. He also bought a ranch of several thousand acres in North Carolina, on which he ranged 300 head of Black Angus cattle, including a breeding bull worth $125,000. Lucas rubbed shoulders with the elite of the entertainment, political, and criminal worlds, stating later that he had met Howard Hughes at one of Harlem's best clubs in his day. Though he owned several mink and chinchilla coats and other accessories, Lucas much preferred to dress casually and corporately so as not to attract attention to himself. When he was arrested in the mid-1970s, all of Lucas's assets were seized. In January 1975, Lucas's house in Teaneck, New Jersey was raided by a task force consisting of 10 agents from Group 22 of the U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration and 10 New York Police Department detectives attached to the Organized Crime Control Bureau. In his house, authorities found $584,683 in cash, though Lucas contended that the officers executing the search departed with the full $11 million temporarily stored in his attic, and documented only 5% of the currency seized. He was later convicted of both federal and New Jersey state drug violations, thanks to nearly 2 years of detective work by the Z-Team, Eddie Jones, Al Spearman, and Benny Abruzzo. Frank Lucas was sentenced to 70 years in prison. Once convicted, Lucas provided evidence that led to more than 100 further drug-related convictions. For his safety in 1977, Lucas and his family were placed in the Witness Protection Program. In 1981, after 5 years in custody, his 40-year federal term and 30-year state term were reduced to time served plus lifetime parole. In '84, he was caught and convicted of trying to exchange 1 ounce of heroin and $13,000 for 1 kilogram of cocaine. He received a sentence of 7 years and was released from prison in 1991. In 2012, while living in Newark, he pleaded guilty to attempting to cash a $17,000 federal disability benefit check twice. Due to his advanced age and his poor health, which included his restriction to a wheelchair, prosecutors agreed to a sentence of 5 years probation. Frank's wife, Julie Farried, was also convicted for her role in her husband's criminal enterprise and spent 5 years in prison. After she was released, the couple lived separately for some years, and Farried moved back to Puerto Rico. After several years, however, they reconciled, and according to a December 2007 Village Voice article, had been married for 40 years at the time. Rayful Edmond III was an American former drug trafficker in Washington, D.C. in the 1980s. He is largely responsible for having introduced crack cocaine into the Washington, D.C. area during the crack epidemic, resulting in an escalating crime rate in the city, which became known as the murder capital of the United States. Edmond was alleged to have moved large amounts of cocaine. In an indictment involving an Edmond associate, Dwayne D.C. Scorpio, it was said that they bought between 1,000 and 2,000 kilos per week in 1992 from the Trujillo Blanco brothers, who were associated with the Medellin cartel, and sold the drugs to Washington area wholesalers. He was known to have spent over $400,000 in an exclusive Georgetown store, Linea Pitti, specializing in Italian men's clothing, owned by Charles Wynn, who was later convicted on 34 counts of money laundering. Edmond's estimated revenue was approximately $300 million annually. In 1 year, Edmond's organization, which employed 150 people, committed 30 murders. Edmond was an avid fan of the Georgetown Hoyas, and frequently sat courtside with his entourage at the Capitol Center for home games. At the height of his empire, he became very friendly with several Hoyas players. When Georgetown University basketball coach and D.C. native John Thompson confirmed what was happening, he sent word through his sources to have Edmond meet him at his office at McDonough Gymnasium. When Edmond arrived, Thompson was initially cordial and informed Edmond that he needed to cease all contacts with his players, specifically John Turner and Alonzo Mourning, both of whom had befriended Edmond. However, Thompson's parting words to Edmond were that Edmond would face serious consequences if he did not stay away from his players. It is believed that Thompson is the only person to stand up to Edmond without consequence, initially causing some shock and surprise that there was no reprisal against Thompson for it. However, in a memoir published posthumously in December 2020, Thompson characterized the encounter very differently, calling it very respectful. Thompson asked Rayful if he would make sure that Alonzo and John were not wrapped up in any of the illegal activity. Rayful told Thompson that he would take care of it, and both men left the meeting in agreement and with respect for each other as human beings. Rayful is quoted as saying afterwards, "Coach Thompson is cool as hell." Rayful Edmond was arrested on April 15, 1989, at the age of 24. His arrest and subsequent trial were widely covered by local and national media. Judicial officials, fearful of reprisals from members of Edmond's gang, imposed unprecedented security during the trial. Jurors' identities were kept secret before, during, and after trial, and their seating area was enclosed in bulletproof glass. The presiding judge even barred the public from the trial in an effort to protect the jury. Edmond was jailed at the maximum security facility at Marine Corps Base Quantico in Virginia and flown to the federal courthouse in Washington, D.C. by helicopter each day for his trial. Authorities took this unusual step due to heightened fears of an armed escape attempt. On September 17, 1990, the district court imposed sentences of mandatory life without parole on count 1, life without parole on counts 2 and 5, 60 months on count 11, and 48 months on counts 14, 15, 16, and 18. Edmond's sentences were to run concurrently. He was eventually sentenced to life in prison without parole. His mother, Constance Bootsy Perry, was sentenced to 14 years in prison for participating in his criminal enterprise. Several of his sisters and cousins also received sentences. Edmond continued to deal after being incarcerated in the Lewisburg Federal Penitentiary in Pennsylvania. He hooked up with Dixon Dario and Osvaldo Chiqui Trujillo Blanco, son of Griselda godmother Trujillo Blanco, who shared the same cell block with him. Edmond was setting up deals between D.C. area traffickers and his Colombian connection while incarcerated. In 1996, Edmond and another drug dealer from Atlanta, named Lowe, were convicted after conducting drug business from a federal prison phone. Edmond received an additional 30-year sentence. In an interview with the Bureau of Prisons, Edmond said he had spent several hours every day on the telephone, occasionally using 2 lines simultaneously to conduct his drug business. Attorney General Eric Holder criticized the Federal Bureau of Prisons for its lax management that allowed drug deals to be conducted from inside prison. In 1996, federal authorities revealed that Edmond had become a government informant. With Edmond's cooperation, the government arrested 11 alleged drug dealers working in Washington, D.C. In exchange, federal prosecutors agreed to seek a reduced sentence for Edmond's mother. In 2019, Edmond returned to D.C. for hearings on whether his life sentence should be reduced to time served, based on the information he provided to authorities concerning 20 homicides. At the time, a survey by the District of Columbia Attorney General showed that half of D.C. residents thought Edmond should be released. In 2021, Judge Emmett G. Sullivan granted the government's request for early release, although Edmond has a separate 30-year sentence for running his operation from prison. On July 31, 2024, Edmond was transferred from prison to a halfway house at an undisclosed location in Kentucky or Tennessee under the supervision of the Bureau of Prisons' Nashville Residential Reentry Management Office. Rayful Edmond has been released from prison as of the summer of 2024. Roy DeMeo was born on September 7, 1940. In the Flatlands neighborhood of Brooklyn in New York City into a working-class Italian immigrant family originating from Formia in the region of Lazio. The fourth of 5 children of Antonio Joseph Anthony DeMeo, a laundry company deliveryman, and Eleanor DeMeo, née Colarulo. Roy graduated from James Madison High School in 1959, during which time he began earning money as a loan shark. Economist Walter Block and future presidential candidate Bernie Sanders were among DeMeo's graduating year classmates. Between the ages of 15 and 22, DeMeo worked at a local grocery store, where he trained as an apprentice butcher. His older brother, Anthony Frank Chubby DeMeo, a United States Marine Corps corporal, was killed in action during the Korean War on April 23, 1951, aged 20. DeMeo's father died of a heart attack on December 12, 1960, when Roy was aged 19, and his mother subsequently returned to Italy with Roy's youngest brother to live with relatives near Naples. DeMeo was initially an associate of the Brooklyn faction of the Lucchese crime family, which controlled towing companies, junkyards, and car theft operations in Flatlands and Canarsie. Anthony Nino Gaggi, a soldier in the Gambino crime family, noticed DeMeo in 1966 and told him that he could make even more money with his successful business if he shifted his allegiance to the Gambinos. Through the late 1960s, DeMeo's organized crime prospects increased on two fronts. He continued in the loan sharking business with Nino and began developing a crew of young men involved in car theft. It was this collective of criminals that became known both in the underworld and in law enforcement circles as the DeMeo crew. The first member of the DeMeo crew was 16-year-old Harvey Chris Rosenberg, who met DeMeo in 1966 when he was dealing marijuana at a Canarsie gas station. The gang helped Rosenberg increase his business and profits by loaning him money so that he could deal in larger amounts. By 1972, Rosenberg had introduced his friends to Roy, and they began working for him as well. The additional members of the crew came to include Joseph and Patrick Testa, Anthony Center, Richard and Frederick Dinome, Henry Borelli, Joseph Dracula Guglielmo DeMeo's cousin, and later, Vito Arena and Carlo Profeta. Roy joined a Brooklyn credit union in 1972, gaining a position on the board of directors shortly afterward. He utilized his position to launder money earned through his illegal ventures. He also introduced colleagues at the credit union to a lucrative side business, laundering the money of drug dealers he had become acquainted with. He also built up his loan sharking business with funds stolen from credit union reserves. His collection of loan shark customers, while still primarily those in the car industry, soon included other businesses such as a dentist's office, an abortion clinic, restaurants, and flea markets. He was also listed as an employee for a Brooklyn company named S&C Sportswear Corporation, and frequently told his neighbors he worked in construction, food retailing, and the used car business. Bonanno family underboss Salvatore Vitale claimed to the FBI that in 1974 he was ordered to deliver the corpse of a man who had just been murdered to a garage in Queens so that it could be disposed of by Roy. In late 1974, a conflict escalated between the DeMeo crew and Andre Katz, a young auto repair shop owner who was partners with DeMeo in a stolen car ring. In January 1975, Katz visited the Brooklyn District Attorney's office and voluntarily provided them information that Rosenberg was heavily involved in car theft. Roy learned about the meeting immediately afterward from an NYPD auto crimes detective on his payroll. DeMeo ordered Borelli to contact a female acquaintance, Babette Judith Questel, about being used as bait. In May 1975, Katz appeared before a Brooklyn grand jury and divulged what he knew about the DeMeo crew's illegal activities. On June 13, 1975, Questel was used to successfully lure Katz to her apartment complex for what he thought was a date, where upon arrival he was immediately abducted by members of Roy's crew. He was then taken to the meat department of a supermarket in Rockaway Beach, Queens, where he was stabbed multiple times in the heart and then in the back with a butcher knife. After being decapitated, Katz's head was then put through a machine normally used for compacting cardboard boxes, where it was crushed. The body parts were wrapped in plastic bags and deposited into the supermarket's dumpster, where they were discovered days later when a pedestrian walking his dog spotted one of Katz's legs lying on a curb near the store. The police reported to the press that a grisly, brutal killing had occurred, but that was the extent of the information given. The body was identified as Katz's 2 days later through the use of dental records. As the 1970s progressed, DeMeo cultivated his followers into a crew experienced with the process of murdering and dismembering victims. with the exception of killings intended to send a message to any who would hinder their criminal activities, or murders that presented no other alternative. A set method of execution was established by the crew to ensure that victims would be dispatched quickly and then made to disappear. The style of execution was dubbed the Gemini method, after the Gemini Lounge, a bar which served as the primary hangout of the crew, as well as the site where most of their victims were killed. The process of the Gemini method, as revealed by multiple crew members and associates who became government witnesses in the early 1980s, was to lure the victim through the side door of the lounge and into the apartment in the back portion of the building. At this point, a crew member, almost always DeMeo according to crew member turned government witness Frederick Denomi, would approach with a silenced pistol in one hand and a towel in the other, shooting the victim in the head, then wrapping the towel around the victim's head wound like a turban to stanch the blood flow. Immediately after, another member of the crew, originally Rosenberg, would stab the victim in the heart to prevent more blood from pumping out of the gunshot wound. By then, the victim would be dead, at which point the body would be stripped of clothing and dragged into a bathroom, where the remaining blood drained out or congealed within the body. This was to eliminate the messiness of the next step, when crew members would place the body onto plastic sheets laid out in the main room and proceed to dismember it, cutting off the arms, legs, and head. Following dismemberment, the body parts would then be put into bags, placed in cardboard boxes, and sent to the Fountain Avenue landfill in Brooklyn. So many tons of garbage were dropped each day at the dump that it would be nearly impossible for the bodies to be discovered. During the initial stages of an early 1980s investigation targeting the DeMeo crew, a plan by authorities to excavate sections of the dump to locate remains was aborted when it was deemed too costly and unlikely to locate any meaningful evidence. The landfill, opposite the Starrett City apartment complex on Pennsylvania Avenue in the East New York section of Brooklyn, was closed in 1985 and capped over since. All signs and odors that a landfill had existed are gone, replaced by parkland. Some victims were killed in other ways for varying reasons. At times, suspected informants or those who committed an act of disrespect against a member of the crew or their superiors had their bodies left in the streets to serve as a message and warning. There were also occasions where it would not be possible to lure the intended victim into the Gemini Lounge, in which case other locations would have to be used. A cabin cruiser owned by Richard Denomi was used on at least one occasion to dispose of remains at sea. In the latter half of 1975, Roy became a silent partner in a peep show and prostitution establishment in Bricktown, New Jersey, after the owner of the business became unable to pay his loan-sharking debts. DeMeo also began dealing in bestiality and illegal underage porn, which he sold to his New Jersey establishment as well as connections in Rhode Island. When Nino found out about DeMeo's involvement in such taboo films, he demanded that DeMeo stop under the threat of death. However, DeMeo defied Gaggi and continued the practice. Nino did not retaliate, and, according to his nephew, Dominic Montiglio, the subject was never mentioned again as long as DeMeo continued making payments to Nino. DeMeo also dealt in narcotics despite the Gambino family strictly forbidding such activity. He financed a major operation importing Colombian marijuana, which was unloaded from an offshore freighter and sold at various auto shops in Canarsie, and also sold cocaine out of the Gemini Lounge. As 1975 drew to a close, Roy was the subject of Internal Revenue Service investigations into his income. Months earlier, his credit union had been pushed into insolvency as a result of the plundering of its finances by him and his crew. DeMeo quit the credit union as a result. Before an indictment could be handed down against him, DeMeo utilized false affidavits from businesses owned by friends and acquaintances claiming he was on their payrolls as an employee. These affidavits served to account for some of his income, allowing him to reach a settlement with the IRS. Roy's sources of income, as well as his crew, continued to grow. By July 1976, he added an automobile firm by the name of Team Auto Wholesalers to his loan shark customers. The owner of Team Auto, Matthew Rega, also purchased stolen vehicles from the crew and sold them off at a New Jersey car lot that he owned. Roy also involved himself with hijacking delivery trucks from John F. Kennedy International Airport. His crew now included Edward Danny Grillo, a hijacker who had just been released from prison. In the fall of 1976, the Gambino family went through a massive change when its boss, Carlo Gambino, died of natural causes. Paul Castellano was named as Gambino's successor, with Neil Delacroce retaining the position of underboss. The implications of this were twofold for DeMeo. Nino was elevated to the position of captain, taking over the crew of men Castellano previously headed. This promotion was beneficial for DeMeo, whose mentor was now even closer to the family leadership. Another advantage was that, with Gambino deceased, new associates would be eligible for membership into the family. Castellano did not immediately open the books for new members, opting instead to promote existing members and reshuffle his capos to new crews. He also allegedly opposed the idea of DeMeo being made, looking down on street-level members and instead involving himself in white-collar crime. Additionally, Castellano felt Roy was uncontrollable. Nino's attempts at persuading Castellano to make DeMeo were continually rejected. By 1977, DeMeo became distraught by this situation and searched for opportunities that would ensure larger returns for his superiors. DeMeo secured his induction into the Gambino family by forming an alliance with an Irish-American gang known as the Westies, based in Hell's Kitchen. The leader of a rival Irish gang, Mickey Spillane, was causing delays for the construction of the Jacob K. Javits Convention Center, much to the frustration of Castellano, who had an interest in the project. After the unsolved murder of Spillane in May 1977, Westies leader James "Jimmy" Coonan assumed control of the Irish mob rackets on the west side of Manhattan. DeMeo, sensing an opportunity to create a vast source of income for the Gambino family, persuaded Nino to consider a partnership with the Westies. Shortly afterwards, Coonan and his second-in-command, Mickey Featherstone, were called to a meeting with Castellano, in which they agreed to become a de facto arm of the family and share 10% of all profits. In exchange, the Westies would be privy to several lucrative union deals and take on murder contracts for the family. It was his pivotal role in the Westie-Gambino alliance that reportedly convinced Castellano to give Roy his button, or formally induct him into the family. Roy was made and put in charge of handling all family business with the Westies. He was ordered to get permission before committing any murders and to avoid drug dealing. His crew, however, continued to sell large amounts of cocaine, marijuana, and a variety of narcotic pills. Roy also continued to commit unsanctioned killings, such as the 1977 double homicide of Jonathan Quinn, a car thief suspected of cooperating with law enforcement, and Cherie Golden, Quinn's 19-year-old girlfriend. The DeMeo crew dumped the bodies in locations where they would be discovered to serve as a warning against cooperation with authorities. In 1978, Frederick Dinomi, previously Roy's chauffeur, joined the crew. DeMeo and his crew murdered Grillo, who had fallen into heavy debt with Roy and was believed to be becoming susceptible to police coercion. Grillo, who was dismembered and disposed of like many of the crew's victims, was the first known occurrence of internal crew discipline. The next member to be killed was Rosenberg, who had set up a drug deal with a Cuban man living in Florida, and then murdered him and his associates when they traveled to New York to complete the sale. The Cuban had connections with a Cuban drug cartel, raising the possibility of violence between the Gambino family and the Cubans unless Rosenberg was dealt with. DeMeo was ordered to kill Rosenberg, but stalled for weeks. During this period, DeMeo committed his most public murder. The victim was a college student with no criminal ties named Dominic Ragucci, who was paying for his tuition as a door-to-door salesman. DeMeo saw Ragucci parked outside his house in Massapequa Park, Long Island, and assumed he was a Cuban assassin. DeMeo and crew members Joseph Guglielmo and Frederick Dinome pursued Ragucci in a 7-mile car chase on Route 110 through Amityville and Farmingdale, after which the student was shot to death by DeMeo. After returning home and gathering his family, DeMeo drove them out of Long Island and left them at a hotel in upstate New York for 2 weeks. According to DeMeo's son, Albert, he started crying when he discovered he had murdered an innocent teenager and did not eat for several days afterwards. The public execution also put a strain on DeMeo's relationship with his wife Gladys, who had previously been able to ignore her husband's criminal activities. Nino was infuriated by the murder of Ragucci and ordered DeMeo to kill Rosenberg before there were any other innocent victims. On May 11, 1979, Rosenberg reported to the Gemini lounge for the crew's usual Friday night meeting. Shortly after his arrival, DeMeo fired a single bullet into the unsuspecting Rosenberg's head. The usually ice-cold DeMeo hesitated when the still-living Rosenberg managed to rise off the floor to one knee, but Center then moved in and finished him off with 4 shots to the head. Unlike Grillo, Rosenberg's body was not dismembered or made to disappear. The Cubans had demanded that his murder make the newspapers. DeMeo's men placed Rosenberg's body in his car and left it on the side of Cross Bay Boulevard, near the Gateway National Wildlife Refuge in Broad Channel, Queens, to be found. Albert later recounted that Rosenberg's murder affected his father deeply, and that when DeMeo came home after the killing, he went into his study room and didn't emerge for 2 days. After the murder, DeMeo spent 6 weeks hiding out with Guglielmo in a safe house near 42nd Street in Times Square, growing a full beard and disguising himself with a baseball cap and sunglasses when out in public. As 1979 continued, DeMeo began to expand his business activities, in particular his auto theft operation, which soon became the largest in history of New York City. Dubbed the Empire Boulevard operation by FBI agents, it consisted of hundreds of stolen cars being shipped from the port of Newark to Kuwait and Puerto Rico. DeMeo put together a group of 5 active partners in the operation, all of whom earned approximately $30,000 a week each in profit. Aside from stolen automobiles, DeMeo was also shipping cigarettes and pornographic magazines to the Middle East. Aside from the active partners, other associates and crew members performed the actual stealing of the automobiles off the streets of New York. Among these associates was Vito Arena, a longtime car thief and armed robber who began working for DeMeo in 1978 after murdering his old partner. Like DeMeo, Arena became closely involved with the DeMeo crew by the end of the 1970s. In 1979, the Empire Boulevard operation was nearly stopped by a legitimate car dealer who threatened to inform the police. He was murdered along with an uninvolved acquaintance before he could provide authorities with information. In late 1979, DeMeo and Nino became involved in a conflict with James Ippolito and James Ippolito Jr., 2 Maid Gambino members in Nino's crew. They were the paternal uncle and cousin, respectively, of a corrupt former New York City Police Department detective, Luis Ippolito, whose father, Ralph, brother of James Sr., was also a made member of the Gambino family. The elder Ippolito met with Paul and accused Nino and Roy of drug dealing, which carried the penalty of death. The Gambino boss, to whom Nino was a close ally, sided against Ippolito and gave Nino permission to do what he pleased. He and DeMeo shot both Ippolitos to death in the younger Ippolito's car en route to the Gemini lounge on October 1, 1979. A witness driving by right as the shots were fired within the parked car alerted a nearby police officer, who arrested Nino after a shootout between the two that left Nino with a bullet wound in his neck. Since DeMeo had split up with Nino as they left the scene, he was not arrested or identified by the witness. Nino Gacci was charged with murder and the attempted murder of a police officer, but through jury tampering was convicted only of assault and given a 5 to 15-year sentence in federal prison. DeMeo murdered the witness shortly after Nino's sentencing in March 1980. The Empire Boulevard operation had continued to expand into 1980, only until the warehouse serving as its headquarters was raided by agents from the Newark branch of the FBI that summer. Henry Borelli and Frederick D. Nomi were arrested in May 1981 for their roles in the operation, but there was not enough evidence to arrest any of the other active partners. DeMeo ordered Borelli and D. Nomi to plead guilty to the charges. Roy thought that this would stop any further investigations into his activities, but he was wrong.